So good afternoon, all in Texas, at South by Southwest, and today is a core conversation, which means interactive, hopefully, and the topic area that we're going to cover is kind of provocative and controversial, and I'll put out a few definitions that might start the conversation in a way. Each person has their own definitions and feelings and social programming about the topic today. The topic is sex, ego, death, internet, and singularities, plural, and how these things interrelate to each other. I have a few slides that I'll go through and pose some questions, and feel free to interrupt with any kind of emotional response or question or argument of a redefinition or any feeling you have. So I'll start just to give you a little context. This is a picture of all the internet routers on the internet over a 24-hour period, and you can see the sleeping routers moving across the earth as people sleep, and the red and yellow routers moving across the earth as people are awake and busy. We're in China here, Europe, moving to the across the Atlantic and to the east coast of the U.S. and then the west coast in South America. And if you look at this a certain way, this is the internet sleeping and awake. And the internet, I'll posit for the sake of discussion, is becoming alive. And it's not just an electronic thing, in that people often think of the internet as an inanimate electronic system, but remember, there's a billion people in the internet at least, and those billion people are alive. They're part of the internet. They're part of what makes it work, and they go to sleep, and they are awake, and they do things, and they think, and they answer questions, and they mess with things. So the internet, as an example, is a hybrid electronic biological system on a global scale. So one of the things in the introduction to the talk in the catalog is how does death relate to sex more than it relates to life? And this is counterintuitive for non-biologists or non-microbiologists, but and it's very common for human beings to think of things from a human perspective and from their own personal perspective, sort of self-referential. And one of the things that to consider is most of the biomass of life on Earth, more than half, is microbes that live in the ocean. And microbes don't have sex. Microbes don't breed in a sexual way. They simply divide when there's enough resources by a process known as mitosis, where one cell becomes two smaller cells, but nobody dies. There's not gender, there's not sex, and that's the majority of life, both by number and by weight, on the planet. And interestingly, these microbes are in a soup of viruses that some people would call not alive. I would argue that viruses are alive. The argument is about a virus needs a complex life form to replicate, but an interesting metric is about half of the bacteria in the oceans are killed by viruses every day. So half of the life forms on the planet that are non-sexual, that are immortal, that divide by simple division, are attacked and killed by viruses on a daily basis. And so in that sense, dying by attack and not dying by aging. And that's sort of the default way of life and death working on this planet in biochemistry and water. And the sex is kind of an invention of taking the genetics in an organism or two organisms and shuffling the cards together so that the virus is less likely to understand how to attack, because then each generation is progressively different. And this is how sex evolved as being the preferred mechanism of replicating for complex organisms. And there's something halfway in between. There's some species, snails for example, that are hermaphroditic in that if they can't find a breeding partner, they have both the male and female parts and they're able to breed with themselves. But in difficult times where they're lonely, that's their mechanism. It makes them more vulnerable to parasites, but if they're more mating partners possible, then they will choose those. And so why, if simply copying yourself leads to immortal cell lines, and this can be complex organisms like jellyfish or sea anemones that effectively are immortal in that they have a way to self-repair. They don't necessarily use sex, but why would you have sex relate to death and aging in that sense? And I would just suggest to consider that aging is like a clock, in that an individual within a species who is born has a clock that turns on puberty, turns on menopause, and turns off life, which is aging and death. It's not always just because of damage to the cells, because there's species that live for tens of thousands of years, and if it was simply a matter of damage by environmental factors, they would live the same length as other species. So things like fruit flies live, or fireflies live days. More complex organisms live years. Humans live relatively long, proportionate to other species, but there are many species, redwood trees, for example, that live vastly longer than humans. And so there's a whole range of strategies of different kinds of species that have a different relationship with breeding, replication, sex, and death. And another reason that death is an important part of a life cycle from an individual point of view, not the species point of view, but an individual point of view, is that if the population of older individuals continued to stay around, they would effectively be a reservoir in which parasites could fester and live, and then attack the new generation as they come along. And so from an evolutionary point of view, there's a good reason to clock out the individuals who are beyond, substantially beyond the effective breeding range. And breeding doesn't just mean procreative biological breeding, but in humans in particular, what makes up me or a human is my genetic information, and then the food that I've eaten, and my biological breeding capability. But what makes up a person now is also all of the information that we've learned, and what we can pass on not only to our own progeny, but to culture and society, and first the tribe and then the group. And that adds to their survivability. So when great-grandma says when the weather is this and such a way, you should plant the crops later, that's something that she maybe knows from her great-grandmother that is important to the survival of the future generations. And so it's valuable to keep non-breeding individuals around in society uh, to keep the species alive. And so species themselves live and die. 99% of species are extinct, or species that have existed on this planet before. And so a true death in a sense, is a species going extinct. And until recently, it hasn't been possible to de-extinct species. Now with genetic technology, it's becoming possible to. But immortality is something that already exists for certain species, as I mentioned, and it's something that's programmable. So sex is basically shuffling the information, both the memes, the ideas about survival, and the genetics. So a few definitions. Well, what is life at Singularity University or some of the other places? I ask people, physicists and theoretical biologists and different kinds of experts from different views, like what is their minimum definition of life? And it usually has sort of two parts. One is it's information, usually biochemical information, that has some form of what they call anti-entropic characteristics. So entropy is the nature in physics of things to structures to dissolve into randomness. And what life, in a sense, does is it struggles and it has a mechanism to keep its structure replicated. And it, of course, evolves. So in evolution, there's something called speciation, where a particular kind of horse, for example, might speciate into a predecessor of horses and donkeys might speciate into two different species, and they in that case, horses and donkeys can breed together, but if they do, they create a halfway in between infertile mule. So horses can breed with horses, donkeys can breed with donkeys. They create successful progeny, but once they start to diverge to a certain point, when they breed together, they can't produce successful offspring. And so this is highly likely to be happening to humans now, in that it's a continuous process of speciation in evolution, and humans are diverse, but there's sort of an increase, for example, in vitro fertilization, or couples who choose to breed together as a social meme, but they're not easily able to reproduce biologically. And so there may be a phenomenon that's going on, and we can talk about it as that the human species is becoming multiple species, maybe those with bones and those without, or those who embrace technology and those who resist it. And this is a natural process. In the long haul, we don't know whether the Amish lifestyle is going to succeed longer than the Google Glass lifestyle, but they're different, and that's sort of a speciation in behavior, which tends to correlate with the speciation in ability to breed together. So in the simplest form of definition of life, if you take out the fancy stuff, life is just information that could be stored in DNA or ideas and memes. And it's now becoming possible to read that information into a computer, so convert from chemistry to data, and now possible to convert from data back into biochemistry that's alive. And the first time this was proven in a lab was 2010 by Craig Venter, who took a living cell, took out its DNA, put it all in the computer as data. In a laboratory, made synthetic DNA that was the DNA necessary to have that cell be alive, built the DNA on a computer with chemistry, reintroduced it into the cell, and the cell booted up as alive and was able to self-replicate. So it was the first life form on Earth whose parents were a computer and not biological. So that kind of technology is advancing very rapidly, and the possibilities of creating new life forms from scratch out of the computer, or taking extinct life forms like woolly mammoths or passenger pigeons or perhaps even Neanderthals, and reconstructing their DNA in the computer, synthesizing the DNA using synthetic technology, and then reintroducing it into a biological cell, you can bring back species that are dead or otherwise known as extinct. And this is becoming technologically possible simply because the essence of life there is chemical information or computer information, and you can read and write in either direction. And life is a little bit more complicated than that, in that there's an interplay between our genetic information and our environmental information, where we start out as a fertilized egg and grow into a fetus and become born. And at that point, we're mostly human DNA. Most of the cells in our body as an infant are come from the germ cells and our mother. However, while growing in the mother, there's a lot of exchange of chemicals going back and forth, that more data comes from the mother than the father, in that the mitochondria that are in all of our cells come from the mother exclusively. And as the fetus develops, the information, the food that the mother's eating, goes into the biochemistry of the fetus. But as soon as we're born and we start eating food, we start to accumulate DNA data from our food, basically. And that's cells that are in us and are on us. And by the time we're an adult, we actually have about 10 times more cells and genes that came from our food and from what we touched and what we drank and the other things in our environment than we have human DNA. So if we were to put me in a blender and blender me up and take out a sample and sequence it, it would be more than 90% microbial DNA from like what I had for breakfast, and only less than 10% DNA from my parents. So this, I'll go through these concepts of sort of the interplay between life, ego, consciousness, relationships. What does orgasm have to do with this? Sex, and then death, which we've already touched on. In a little bit more detail, life, as I mentioned, is propagating information. Ego is something that infants don't have. They're completely one with their mother. Even as they're nursing and so forth, they don't have a sense of separateness. And that's something that evolves towards age 1 or 2, that humans get a sense of being separate from others. And it kind of maximizes around puberty and breeding time, where the sense of ego is something to say, I'm different than my siblings, I'm different than my parents, I'm different than my biological kin. And it's one of the mechanisms, in addition to smell and taste of the immune systems and so forth, that have us not be attracted to inbreed with our own family members. And it's the psychological element of saying, I'm separate, I'm special, and I should find somebody different than people who I'm related to not just breed sexually or biologically with, but also exchange ideas with. And that is, Matt Ridley has a concept called idea sex, which is why we seek out people who are different than ourselves to interact with on ideas and interact with breeding. Because if we don't do that, we have inbreeding, and most of you know the downsides of that. Consciousness is something we'll touch in more detail, but in my opinion, it's something that comes in gradients, and that like a dial where there's more consciousness when we're awake and paying attention, and less when we're sleepy, and less when we're asleep, and even less when we're in a coma, and turn it all the way down when we're dead. So it's not something that's like that person's conscious and that person's not, or that plant is not conscious and that dog is conscious. It's a continuum, in my opinion. Relationships is part of us in that we're an individual person, our ego, saying I'm me and I'm separate than you. But there's a concept from psychiatry that we form a mental model of the people in our lives. And the more intimate and close we are to a person, the more accurate our mental model is of who they are and how they'll behave. And we can run simulations of in our mind of what that is likely happening to that person the better we know them. An example being identical twins who grew up together, who ate together, who pretty much know everything about each other. They often report a special instinct to say, well, something just happened to my twin who might be in a different country, because they have a mental model of the person and their behavior and what they say and what their kind of range of activities and risks are. And it's sort of a sixth sense or an instinct to say that something might be going on. So the more intimate we are with somebody, the more accurate our mental model is of our ability to predict what might be going on with them. And so the way the internet plays into that is all we need is little cues, like an emoji smiley face from somebody we have a intimate mental model with, to know that they're okay or that they're sad, or we can feel empathetically what's going on with them with a very little bit of data being transmitted between us. Where if you send the same information to somebody you hardly know at all and don't have an accurate mental model of, well, they may not know what the sad face means. Where if you send it to a more intimate person or one of your children or something, well, they'll know much more likely, more accurately what it is about. And so one of the things that we're familiar with is orgasm, in that's a state that one of the most intense states that people feel, and usually related to sex and breeding. And one of the reasons it's such a positive feedback neurologically is that it's very close to the essence of the moment of doing something that you're likely to be propagating your genetics to future generations. So as a programming feedback point of view, it's a way that your experience is saying, that was good, that was on target, that's something I should do more of. And things that have happened in the last 50 years, however, is with birth control and family planning and more sophisticated understanding of how biological breeding goes. The act of sex and the experience of orgasm is becoming more something that's recreational and for pleasure, and not necessarily as closely related to breeding only. And it has an interesting effect with regard to ego, in that it's pretty much impossible to have an orgasm unless you turn off your ego. And the ego is often saying, careful, careful, make sure this is an appropriate breeding partner before you let go. And that's something with birth control and other sort of orgasmic practices is something that is changing, where it dissolves the ego. In the early brain imaging research shows that while males and females are going through orgasm, if they're stimulating themselves, it's like tickling yourself. You can't really do it. You can fake it in a sense, and the top cortex part of your brain where your ego lives in the brain imaging machines is fairly active with self-stimulation, but with partner stimulation. And there's studies going on at Rutgers and Groningen in the Netherlands and other places where they're finding a difference between self-stimulated orgasm and partner-stimulated orgasm, in that the cortex, or the thinking part of the brain where your ego lives, shuts down in orgasm, which is sort of an indication that there's sort of the experiential thing where you have to let go of your ego and your fears to allow yourself to have an orgasm. The neuroscience is kind of backing that up, where the place in the brain where the ego lives shuts down during the moment of orgasm. And so it's also a kind of a process of rebooting your mind, body, ego, physical connection. In the same way you reboot your computer or reboot your phone, where you actually shut down the apps that are running, like your to-do list and your tax worries and things like this, and allow yourself to drop into your body and connect with your partner, and then you sort of rebuild your consciousness afterwards. So it's a form of rebooting, and it also releases, for example, the neurohormone oxytocin that is sort of the bonding hormone, where whoever that was that experience was with, or whatever circumstance that was good, and I will repeat that, and that's sort of neuromodulated chemically. And so sex is evolving from something that was shuffling our genes and shuffling our memes, and mostly for reproduction, with the advent of birth control, which hasn't really fully gotten into society and culture. There's a lot of lingering things from only 50 years ago that mostly carried by religions, that, well, you shouldn't do that, or you should only do that if your intention is breeding, and so forth. And we can talk about that. And then finally here, death is not a clear-cut thing. The definition of death is changing continuously over thousands of years, where it used to be that somebody was dead when they stopped breathing. And it was learned that people could be resuscitated even if they'd stopped breathing. And so that no longer was the measure. And for a while, the definition of that person is dead is because their heart has stopped. But it's been figured out, how do you restart a person's heart and keep a person alive even if they've stopped breathing and their heart has stopped. And so the modern present definition of death is because somebody's brain is stopped. And the medical technology is such that you can keep a person breathing and their heart running and their body alive, feeding and so on, even though their brain is dead. But that's the current medical definition of death. But it wasn't the medical definition of death 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And so there's no reason to say that that's going to be the permanent definition of death either. And it's just recently, for example, when people die, what happens to their Facebook? And in just the last month, Facebook has changed its policy from saying only next of kin can post on people's Facebook after they're biologically dead. But they're digitally still alive on Facebook, and that's something that is, or Google Plus or email or whatever. The average person has about 9 personas on the internet, which means if the human population is 7 billion, the internet is 54 billion humans already. And those personas, our digital personas, stay alive in a sense even after we're biologically dead. And so the definition of, well, is Michael Jackson or Elvis or Marilyn Monroe or John Lennon, are they dead? I mean, Michael Jackson's performing in Vegas right now. And the interaction with the data of his performance can actually be better than the real person could do if there's enough data. So the definition of, well, is somebody dead or not is coming up for renewal as to what that means. So that sort of leads into like the interplay between, well, what is a life and the technologies that define life and death, and internet being one, and I'll mention about singularities. So technologies, if you just sort of go through the evolution of technologies in human, some people would say, here's a list of some of the most important inventions of humans, technologies being fire, agriculture, language, money, memory, in a sense like books or cave paintings, and then internet as a way to transport that. And I would posit, as I mentioned at the beginning, that internet is becoming alive. And just as we in our cells in our body have mitochondria in each one of our cells, it's a separate organism that has its own genetics, and it's passed through the mother, and we wouldn't be able to live without those mitochondria inside our cells, giving they're the engine for power. It may well be that the billion people who are in the internet are many of them, millions of them, helping run the internet, and so we may be becoming the mitochondria of the internet, just as there's mitochondria in us helping us run. So it's a concept to think about. And then singularities is a term that comes from physics, from 1916, where somebody had done a mathematical solution to Einstein's field equations that predicted black holes, basically. And then Hawking has been arguing that the nature of what that is not the way that people think about it, but the basic way to think about what a singularity is some circumstances where things change so rapidly that what they're changing into is unpredictable. And there's a discussion about whether we're experiencing a singularity now, what the event horizon is that things are changing into. The way the world works will not fit with the models of the way the world works, the way we think about it now. This is a little bit of detail that we could talk about. I won't go into it in here. And then we already talked about how the brain, body, mind, internet connection is one of the theories of mind. Things that I didn't mention is that when you're in contact with somebody who you have a relatively intimate relationship with, you have a form of limbic resonance. And our limbic system is sort of how we feel. It keeps track of our breathing and our digestion and actually the feeling of us in the room, like whether you can feel me. And if I do something like that, a motion, you can feel it in your body, even though I didn't say what I just did there. And that's the experience people have going to music festivals and the audience reacting to the music, or going to a scary movie and the scary thing happens and the audience jumps. It's a feeling, a limbic resonance between the people. And we have special neurons, mirror cells, and spindle cells that pay attention to these feelings. And it turns out other species, like elephants and dogs, have these same cells, and they can feel what we're feeling. And that's a lot of data that's going between all of us that's not in the language of what we're saying. And so the more contact you have like that, the more data you have going between the people, and the more accurate your model of the person is. So the a little touch on what dreams are is when we're unconscious. So we're conscious beings, but we are unconscious sometimes. We run simulations of what's happening in our relationships. There's an important little detail about the brain. There's people who are trying to reconstruct artificial consciousness in the internet or in computers and AIs that will be substrate independent carriers of their ego. There's things about the brain that are not fully understood yet. For example, Einstein's brain had more or less the same number and density of nerve and synapse connections as a typical person, but he had substantially more glial cells, which are the cells that hold the nerves together. And they don't do electrical communications, but they do chemical communications, and in sort of like a radio, TV broadcast kind of way. And so there's the people who, the connectome projects, or the things that saying, well, if we could only figure out how all the wires are connected together in the brain and the electrical signals that do that, we could reconstruct consciousness in the internet or in a computer. However, the brain works in a much more complicated way with many more channels of communications, and those haven't been anticipated of how they go into the model. And a simple test of, well, if you cut off somebody's oxygen, their intelligence and their behavior will change. Or if you give them a glass of wine, they will change. And their electrical connections are exactly the same. And so there are factors that are obvious in biology, but people who are trying to do artificial things aren't really contemplating those so well. And I'll just touch on a couple things to sort of wig people out a little bit. If you look at the evolution of complexity of organisms on this planet, prokaryotes are simple cells that don't have interior compartments, and eukaryotes are more complicated cells where they have a cell within a cell that replicates as an animal. And then there's more complex animals like fish and worms and humans. But if you plot these on an exponential line going back, and then you just draw a line through it, well, the complex organisms like mammals and fish, going back to simpler organisms, and if you go back to, well, when did life have 0 bits of information? When did it cross 0? And this line would predict that happened like life originated around 9 billion years ago. But the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old, which is kind of an indication that life didn't start here, or somehow it went from nothing to extremely complicated very rapidly, and then for some reason slowed down, which doesn't make too much sense. And so this is a linear fit to the complexity of life on this planet, and a slightly more mathematical fit with a little bit of extra linear function that includes like the difference between mammals and some of the other organisms. You could project this back to about 13 billion years ago, which would suggest that life in its simplest forms started with matter, not on Earth. And it got here somehow. Here's a chart from Edward Tufte, which is the ratio of brain to body size, and it's kind of a measure of intelligence in different species. And I drew a line through it here that there's only a few species that are above this line in terms of extra brain size given their body size. And most creatures are down below the line or very small, having no brains. I should point out that creatures that don't move don't have brains, and like plants. And creatures that move have brains, and brains are mostly related to movement And there even are creatures who are born with brains. They use it in their larval state to find a place to grab onto. As soon as they find their home that they're going to stick onto and become a plant, the first thing they do is eat their brains. So there's this concept that brains are an important part of us and that bigger brains are better. But the important thing about this chart is there are no species up in this upper left-hand quadrant of the chart. And that would indicate whether small or big, there isn't a particular evolutionary advantage to being much smarter than the species that exist now. And people hold intelligence in high regard, but if it was so valuable, there would be some examples up in this quadrant of the chart, and there's just not. Here's an example. I don't know if the audio is working on the computer, but this is a biological data interface where there's a biological part and a data part, and they're interacting naturally. But biology has like an element of free will. Gives a sense of the difference between computer science and biology, where computer science is pretty deterministic. You can predict what's going to happen. And in biology, even simple biology, you can make something, but it doesn't always do what you think you're going to do. There's a group in Russia, Dmitry Iskov mostly, who's working on a program to how do you start with biological humans and create increasingly sophisticated avatar bodies where you can eventually transplant your head and consciousness from your biology into more or less an electronic being. This is from the Global Futures 2045 group based out of Russia. You can find it online. But about 50 years ago, there was research done both in Russia and in the US about how to transplant a head onto a different body. And I'll run a little bit of this.
Then the next step is to be able to transfer these catheters from one animal, let's say body B, to head A.
Okay. We now have separated the head from the body, which has been removed.
And then after you've done the transfer, you've got to turn around and shorten these things. Then you've got to figure out how to get rid of these catheters and sew the vessels together.
Well, if the vessels are sewed together, I think then the principal problem becomes one of rejection, tissue rejection.
And also you were able to put the spine together. See, one of the things that everybody forgets is you've got to work with the spine and the spinal cord. Now, it doesn't make any difference whether we sew the spinal cord together or not. It just is not going to work. And so you got to do a lot of delicate work down there in the spinal column, with the spinal cord, with its vasculature, so that when you finally bring the head over, you just slide it down and you just put in a few screws. We very often drain the body that is not being used. We drain the blood from that into the other animal as a transfusion. There should be another catheter in the esophagus of the body, which is going to sustain the head, and you can use that for feeding purposes.
Well, I think we'll hang in for about another 16 minutes.
You realize that the monkey was not specifically trained to demonstrate intellectual capability. But as soon as it's been decided for this animal to be awakened, I can tell you that because we left the cranial nerves, it could hear, it could smell, it could taste, it would eat, and it would follow you around the room. The tubes that were placed in the mouth, you could see them chewing on them, and We also see it was a very unhappy monkey, but
So it's basically two bodies. This head is removed. The arteries and veins from that head are connected to the destination head, and so basically you're taking this head and putting it on that body. This body's gone, that head's gone. And they've actually done this in dogs and in monkeys. And the head is actually conscious. It follows, tracks with eyes. It can respond in various things. However, they haven't figured out how to attach the spinal column to the rest of the body, so the body is providing nutrients, but it's not a full person. But this was done 40 years ago. So it's obviously not FDA approved. But it gives an indication of the kind of things that are possible but just taboo to do. So I'll sort of close sort of the introduction here with the layers of consciousness of what's awake all the way down to death, where a high state of consciousness would be alert and awake, perhaps like I am now. A flow state is when there's a recent book out, The Rise of Superman, that goes into some detail about the flow states that I've helped with, that the neuroscience of flow, which is a concentration of attention, but not a seeking behavior. And then we can be sleepy because we stayed out late last night, or asleep, which would be considered unconscious. Dreaming is we're running simulations, which is a different form of consciousness. And the simulations are reconciling our memories in the same way that computers do data housekeeping and collection. And we can be under anesthesia or in a coma. And the difference between that and death, whether brain death or individual death, is a blurry area. So I'll leave it there, and this is supposed to be a core conversation, and I've introduced a lot of sort of provocative and radical and taboo things. So feel comfortable to disagree or question or add anything.
Would you talk about the flow more?
Sure. So flow, Mikai Chinitsumihai about 10 years ago did a book called Flow, and he interviewed people around the world, artists and painters and creatives who, when they're working, they get into a state of flow where they're concentrating. He first had the inspiration from mountain climbers who had near-death experiences, who reported how, as they're falling off the mountain, time dilated and their risk of death was high, and they had the presence of mind and the attention to notice that little branch that they grabbed onto that saved their life. And in evolution, those are our ancestors who had that extra conscious capability to save their life and live on to breed. And the ones who fell off the mountain, they're out of the gene pool. So flow is something that highly correlates with extreme sports athletes or high performance, ultimate performance things, in that most people have some experience like being in a car crash or something where everything slows down and you have full attention for all the details and nuance, and those get laid down in your memory in a useful way. But the key element is there's a high risk of a negative outcome, which includes art or music or public speaking or whatever, where if you're a musician performing and you want to be creative and do something a little bit edgy, but the public might go, ew, that's too raspy, and you get rejected from the tribe and you die. And so the risk of severe consequences tends to have people drop into flow. And that's why I put it below awake, is that awake, we're kind of curious and seeking and so forth. In flow, we're concentrating on a life or death situation. And it's a highly conscious state, but in a narrow focus.
I was really interested in ego dissolve with regard to orgasm. I had a question about gender effects, because you hear a lot about the female orgasm, about, oh, you have to let go, you can't think. I've never once read anything about a male orgasm. You have to let go, you have to stop thinking. It's not that hard. So, is there a true gender effect there?
Yeah, definitely there's a gender effect, and I'm helping people who are researching this kind of thing. And there's also a difference between self-stimulation and partner stimulation, in that, and a difference between genders. And gender isn't an A-B, there's actually a continuum of gender identity. But I would challenge you to think that for you to have an orgasm, there is at least a nanosecond where you have to let go of your thoughts. And yeah, maybe 2 nanoseconds. But for women, there's a definition of orgasm that is the experience over time, and there's the moment of climax that most people refer to as orgasm. But for women, it's the feeling over a period of time. And if they're self-stimulating in the brain imaging machines, their cortex is active. They're, in a sense, faking an orgasm because they're busy making themselves have an orgasm. But if they're in the same way as I'm tickling myself, it's not real. However, if a partner strokes you to orgasm, you can actually shut down your thinking, and you can't take yourself out of control, but another person can. So it's a different experience, partner stimulated than self-stimulated, and it's a different experience, male and female. Go ahead.
To kind of tag on to what your question is that you have to also look at, is it socially acceptable? It's more socially acceptable for a man versus a woman. So you have to factor in all those other things that, as little girls, you tell them, no, that's not right, that's not right. But like with boys, it's completely different. So it's also that social stature.
Yeah, that's an important factor. There's this psychological concept called our vigilance center, where we have to evaluate, like, well, what kind of relationship do I have with this person, or are we going to get married, are we going to have children, what kind of lawn are we going to have, that kind of thing, before you can relax. And that's an important thing. It's biologically it's much more important for women because they burden much more of the load evolutionary of becoming pregnant in a sex act where orgasm might be involved. So if they feel comfortable that kind of thing is taken care of, then they can relax more. Yeah.
So then maybe there is the biological, like women have more risk in letting go. And isn't there, they've done some science, like if you actually do reach orgasm during copulation, a woman, like it's easier for her to become pregnant?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of science there. This is kind of a hard thing to research, poking around down there while people are enjoying themselves. But there's a speculative book called Sex at Dawn that goes into this in a little bit of detail, and that women actually, evolutionary strategy is to have multiple different impregnating partners, because you want to have a diversity of children, because you want to mix your genes even more. And males, the design of the male penis is such that it scoops out any semen from previous encounters. And so the refractory period in males of why, if they ejaculate inside a woman and they can't, it takes them half an hour to get ready to go again. And part of that is to give the sperm enough time to get further in there so that if they do go again, they're not pulling out. They've pulled out the previous guy's sperm, but they don't want to pull out their own. However, the woman's ready to go right away. So, yeah, and so some of the theory of that is like the I can't remember who the researcher is, but women actually lubricate when they're being assaulted, basically, and it's a survival thing that if they don't, they could get torn and they could get infected, and it would be deadly. And so many women who are assaulted are actually ashamed of the fact that they kind of got turned on by that happening. But if they didn't, evolutionary, they would be at risk of dying. And so, however, when your vigilance center says this person's okay, this is a safe situation, or actually the experience isn't necessarily going to lead to pregnancy, you can let go much more and allow your ego and cortex to shut down and go with the experience and experience the ride over an extended period of time. For those who are curious about this, there's an organization called One Taste that specializes in female orgasm and has a lot of research and talks about this.
I really hate to be the buzzkill and change the subject from sex to death, but sorry.
They're related.
But yeah, Nicole Didone, One Taste, like he's right. She's like amazing, and get her book and like read about it. I was gonna ask, like, since there's all this crazy gray area around death, like how does someone like myself, who's a little singularity like yourself, how do you prepare for your death in a way that, you know, maybe you live forever, and like how can you consciously understand that you're living forever and be positive, right? Instead of like freaking out, oh my God, I'm in a computer right now. So is there like a prep you can do to?
Yeah.
It's a good question. David Chalmers is a philosopher who proposes that there's a 30% chance we're actually in a simulation right now. And all of this is a simulation, and we're pretending to be free will. But as the internet gets better at simulating avatars of each of us, the more data it has about you, the more accurately it could resimulate you. And there's a sort of a Kurzweil concept of taking my consciousness and copying me into the internet, and that I would then be conscious and alive in the internet, but I'm still standing here. So if that actually worked, I would be there and I would be here, and we would be a lot more like identical twins and have different lives after that, that we don't have to kill the original when we make the copy. And we don't have to make only one copy. We can make many copies. And you could send your different copies on different adventures, but they wouldn't necessarily, they might start out being similar to you, but they would then go on a different life. And then when you're going to copy yourself, do you want to copy yourself at age 13 or at age 23 or at age 54, or what do you want? Or all three. And so to a strategy of, if you want to have yourself, like Craig Venter, who's done the first booted life, it says, if you want to live forever, do something important with your life now. And what you do will live on. So Alfred Nobel is still giving out prizes, and as far, nobody's seen him recently, but Elvis, you can see him driving around in cars in Vegas. So so the more data you upload, the more data there is to reconstruct you with. Okay. So there's literally a practice called orgasmic meditation, which is a daily practice where for 15 minutes you have a partner stroke you with no other conditions like a sitting meditation. And what happens during that 15 minutes doesn't matter. So it's a practice like yoga, and people can check that out.
Yes, it works.
Regarding the question of death, there's some researchers that are documenting that the subparticular atoms and like this, they have a negative entropic value as accumulating data. And this can maybe philosophically open up why we should always live the present, enjoy now, and that maybe we have many deaths all the time because our cells continue with the data.
Yeah, I mean, there is a concept of every moment we're dying. And our moment right now is different than the moment a moment ago. And the moment in a minute will be different than right now. So yeah, you don't have to get into fancy quantum physics or anything like that to just say this is life, this is not life. Any last questions? We're about out of time. So.
About dreams as simulation, how does this relate to psychology and Jungian analysis?
Well, I'll sort of quickly answer that. One of the theories about schizophrenia is that when we're dreaming, our body is paralyzed. And we're dreaming about flying and doing all these things we can't move because our body is paralyzed, but we're thinking through them. And one of the psychopathologies, example schizophrenia, is they may be dreaming and their body's not paralyzed. And a characteristic conversation with a schizophrenic is they're saying these really interesting things, but they're not correlated together. And so they're running through these kind of simulations, but it's not integrated in sort of a awake consciousness. So I'll be out in the hallway. We have to pack this up, but thank you very much for coming.